In the mid-90s, Apple was going through tough times, and many, both then and now, saw a major decline in the quality of its products. One particular laptop has been held up as the poster child for this. But was it really as bad as it's been made out to be? I offered to help out Free Geek Twin Cities with a pile of Mac laptops that needed repair. My goal here wasn't necessarily to do an exhaustive restoration on them, but rather just try to cobble together some working machines. They'd already been triaged, so I had some idea what I was getting myself into. What I'd end up with, though, was anyone's guess. Two of the three machines are PowerBook 5300s, a model launched in August of 1995. It was notable for being Apple's first laptop based on the PowerPC processor, but it had big shoes to fill as it was to be the replacement for the popular PowerBook 500 series. And there's no one better to talk about it than Steve Young, who was the product manager at Apple in charge of its development.
So there's a guy named Dave Rothschild who ran product marketing for the PowerBooks. He wanted a smaller computer, however we could do it.
They ended up with 4 models in the lineup, the main difference between them being the processor speed and display options. The first machine I investigated was a 5300CS, which had a passive matrix color LCD. I've worked on these before and found them to be rather easy to take apart with just a few screws that all use a Torx T8 bit. This machine was labeled as having a missing power input jack. Well, not anymore, as I found it rattling around under the keyboard. This was a common problem, not just with this model but a lot of other laptops over the years, as the stress of the power cable can weaken or break the solder joints on the motherboard. To fix it on the 5300, you have to take the motherboard completely out, which requires disassembling, well, most of the computer. With the palm rest removed, I could take out the hard drive cage. The drive is a 750 megabyte model manufactured by IBM, but it's different from those found in prior PowerBooks in that it uses IDE instead of SCSI. I could then pull the heatsink to expose the main reason for this model's existence, the 100 MHz PowerPC 603E processor. Motorola led its development while they and IBM shared responsibility for manufacturing. Apple had used the regular 603 in a few of its desktop systems at that point, but it hadn't worked out particularly well. The problem was due to the way Macs worked at the time. Apple was still in the middle of transitioning from the Motorola 68000 series of CPUs to PowerPC, and a way to make this smoother for users was to include an emulation layer so that older software could still be run. But the PowerPC 603 only had 8 kilobytes of level 1 cache, which was smaller than the 16 kilobytes the interpreter required. So performance suffered as the system was constantly swapping data to RAM. This wasn't good enough for Young. The 5300 was supposed to be Apple's flagship laptop model.
So I got invited to a party in Austin. This is a classic story. I got invited to a party in Austin, Texas to celebrate this, right? The 603 and the 601. And I'm sitting at a table, my boss, Murray Goldman, who ran semiconductors for Motorola, Russ Stamfeld, who was like his right-hand guy, and a bunch of the engineering guys. And he says, well, what do you think about our 603? I go, like, I'd been complaining to Motorola, like, this is going to be a disaster. And they're, like, ignoring me, right? I've had a couple of cocktails, and my boss is getting nervous, like, what is Steve going to say, right? That's who I was, and that's who I still am. I said, it's going to be a disaster. It's going to be a flop. He goes, what do you mean? I go, the cache is too small. And I told your guys and they ignored me. They just told me, this is what we're doing. Immediately, like the next day, I got an email from them saying, yeah, we're going to make it the 603E.
So with the motherboard out, I could take a look at the power input solder pads. Thankfully, it looked like just the joints themselves had broken. One of the pads had lifted, but it was on the ground plane and only used for mechanically holding the jack. Some quick work with the soldering iron got the pads cleaned up, the jack reinstalled in the PCB, and fresh solder applied. With luck, we should be good to go. Before I tried powering on the machine, I wanted to take a look at its power supply. Some older PowerBook AC adapters had RIFA filter caps in them, which can fail with a pop and a lot of smoke. The enclosure on this one is clipped together with a single screw hiding under the label on the bottom. And to my relief, Apple had gone with a different brand of filter cap that isn't as prone to failure. The other electrolytics looked okay too, so I buttoned it up for now. With the 5300 CS put back together, I plugged it in and it powered on, but all I got was this blank screen. Looks like the backlight was working, but nothing was showing on the display, and the contrast control had no effect. Maybe another one of the PowerBooks could lend some spare parts, and in the case of this one, perhaps maybe even an upgrade. This is a 5300C, which came with a much nicer active matrix color screen instead of the passive matrix in the 5300CS. Its label said it wouldn't boot, which seemed to be mostly true. It would power on and spin up the hard drive, but the screen stayed completely blank without even the backlight. There was the telltale sign of a battery leak inside the machine, so I first decided to swap its display over to the 5300CS. If it worked, it would make for a solid upgrade. But it didn't work on the CS model either, despite being compatible, meaning the display itself likely had a problem. Two laptops that both had broken screens wouldn't get me a working machine, so I'd need to narrow things down even further. With the active matrix screen disassembled, I could look into the three main components: the backlight inverter, LCD panel, and flat flex cable that tied them together. Since the backlight wasn't working, the inverter was my first suspicion, so I took apart the passive matrix screen so I could borrow its inverter, which was the same part. But with the active matrix screen hooked up to the laptop I'd just repaired, the display stayed completely dark. Usually this would implicate the backlight in the LCD itself, but out of curiosity I plugged the passive matrix screen into the PowerBook and hooked up the active matrix panel's backlight, and it lit up just fine. So both inverters worked, as did the backlight. That left just the flat flex cable in question, and sure enough, when testing for continuity, I found several traces that weren't working. This explains why the backlight didn't work, though it's curious since there's no obvious damage. It's a real bummer though, because with the active matrix screen plugged in, you can see an image on it if you hold up a flashlight. And of course, the passive matrix screen has a completely different ribbon cable that isn't compatible. So I'd need to keep troubleshooting that one if I wanted to end up with a working PowerBook. I suspected that perhaps the capacitors on the LCD panel itself had gone bad. This is becoming more common to see, but I was frustrated to find I didn't have the right ones on hand. I needed ones rated for 50 volts, but only had 35. I did notice though that one connector wasn't quite seated fully. Could that be it? Amazingly, yes, it was. The passive matrix panel worked fine now. And what's better is the 5300CS seemed to be working fine too, so I got it reassembled for real this time. Some may question why one would even bother trying to fix this model, as it garnered an unfortunate reputation both now and when it was new. The desire to make it more compact than the 500 series led to some real innovations when it came to engineering and industrial design, but also some serious compromises. The biggest being the lack of an optical drive. Well, kind of.
One of the hard drive guys came up with they had smaller CD drives. Instead of being 3.5, it was like 2.5. And somehow the product marketing guys talked us into putting that into the 5300.
It never made it to production, but that mini CD-ROM drive did briefly see the light of day in the movie Independence Day. in which the 5300 was used to defeat the aliens with the help of Apple's marketing budget. And a prototype unit even showed up in an online auction in recent years.
Very quickly, I said, you know, I'm going to make the bay for that so it's removable, and you can put a battery on either side, because no one is ever going to use this new format, right?
The 5300 ended up starting a tradition among Apple's laptops, at least for the next 5 years or so, of including a hot swappable drive bay. Normally it would hold a floppy drive, but third-party manufacturers offered all sorts of alternatives, such as batteries, second hard disks, and even magneto-optical drives. With the 5300CS reassembled, I could hook up an external blue SCSI through this stupid big cable and boot the machine from it. The hard drive seemed to be healthy, and I could get a fresh installation of macOS 7.6 on it. Along with the laptops came an assortment of memory upgrade cards, and I had thrown in the largest one, which was labeled as a weird 48 megabytes in size. But the 5300CS came with 16 megabytes on board, so the system reported that it had its maximum 64 megabytes installed. I wanted to take one more look at the 5300C. The display was something I simply couldn't fix, but parts from the third laptop in the bin might help me better diagnose the motherboard. While it looks the same, this is a PowerBook 190, which instead of offering a PowerPC processor, went with the outgoing Motorola 68040 in an effort to offer a lower cost model. This one was in rough shape, but when I plugged it in, it booted, so there was hope. I borrowed its screen and connected it to the 5300C, and it lit up. But the computer wasn't booting, and after a few moments gave an ominous sign. A sad Mac, which indicates serious motherboard problems. That battery leak likely caused more damage than was obvious, and honestly, coupled with its bad screen, this machine is probably best used for parts. Which is exactly what I did in order to fix the 190. Its palm rest suffered from broken plastics, which made the trackpad and its button unusable. I also needed to fix its power input jack, which, while not broken off entirely, had gotten loose. But with the motherboard out, a quick reflow of its solder joints was enough to get it sorted. I got to looking closer at the bottom casing and found that several of its screw holes were broken too. Coupled with some other damaged plastics, it made sense to transfer over the entire bottom housing from the 5300, which was in much better shape. It would also offer a couple of upgrades in the form of an infrared transceiver, which was missing on the 190, along with a video outboard that was an optional accessory. The 190 had suffered from a small battery leak, but nowhere near as bad as the 5300. I cleaned the corrosion on the replacement bottom housing with some vinegar and wiped up the residue with an alcohol pad. This copper shielding will never look perfect again, but I applied a layer of Kapton tape to help cover it. My initial plan was to just transfer the entire palm rest and trackpad over from the 5300. But when I got the 190 booted up, I found... What? No! It didn't work. And then I remembered that while a lot of parts between the 5300 and 190 were interchangeable, the trackpad wasn't. So I got the old one moved over to the new palm rest plastics, and that took care of it. There was one small thing on the 190 that I couldn't do anything about. One of the screw holes in its display bezel was broken. This issue in particular is what in part gave the whole 190 and 5300 lineup a bad reputation, as it happened even when the machines were new.
And it had a problem with the display cover. The screw bosses would break off, and so they had to recall those. And when you build a lot of computers, you have problems,
Apple ended up revising the plastics, which in my experience are easiest to spot by the presence of this marking on the serial number sticker. The 190 I just fixed is missing it. But that wasn't the biggest issue the 5300 faced.
We get it to production, and we also put in there C cells that were lithium ion. First product that was mainstream that had these C cell, and they had a lot of power, and they would run 8 hours or something. And we got those from Sony Energy Tech. And Sony said, we're going to design the battery charger. I said, okay, so here's the spec we wrote for talking to the old battery, like talk to the new battery the same way. So it's, I don't know, we built 20,000. We're getting ready to go into production. Well, I get a call. It's a Friday afternoon. I'm sitting in my office. I was in the city center. And it's from one of the SQA guys. And he said, the 5300 blew up. I'm like, what do you mean it blew up? You know, smoke and everything. He goes, yeah, bad. Smoking. I put it out on my porch and then it blew up. I go, like, what do you mean? He goes, well, the fire department just left. And I'm like, we built we built a lot of these already. They were like getting ready to go on trucks to go to stores. And I go, well, bring it in. And he comes right in and he brought in a box and it looked like a bomb went off. You couldn't even tell it was a computer. So there was a guy, what's his name? It'll come back to me. The guy who ran hardware testing for us. He comes up and I show it to him. I go, we can't ship this. This is like dangerous, right? So we write we called our boss and he was like, well, go call our boss. He could call our boss's boss, Howard Lee. And I said, Howard, we can't ship this. This just blew up. I mean, this is really dangerous. He goes, how many have you built? I go, like 20,000. He goes, so every 20,000 you're going to have a failure. I go, no, every 20,000 we're going to have an explosion. He goes, no, that's okay. So Perry Fox and I wrote a letter to the board of directors saying, we don't think we should ship this, and we're not going to take any responsibility personally if anybody gets hurt. The next day on the factory line in Singapore, one blows up on the factory line. I called the vice president of Sony Energy Tech, and I said, your battery just blew up. And he hung up on me. His response was to hang up on me. Meanwhile, we got trucks going out to stores, right? So it was really interesting how they told the trucks to bring them back. They turned off the credit cards. So the guys driving the trucks, when they wanted to fill up, they'd have to call in and they'd say, we'll bring them back, right? To make a long story short, we brought them back, we put NiCads in them, and we never shipped with that battery. And Apple has going to sue Sony over this, right? And Sony was a huge supplier to Apple for displays and power supplies. So there was never a lawsuit, but I think Apple got discounts on displays and power supplies for a very long time.
And as a bit of cosmic retribution, one of Sony's battery manufacturing plants itself ended up getting destroyed by fire. The drama around the plastics and batteries on its own wouldn't have really been enough to sour the 5300's reputation. The actual problem was that those issues happened at a time when Apple itself was struggling. The Windows PC market was booming, and between increased competition and slimmer margins, Apple cut corners and flooded the market with models in an effort to move inventory. The 5300 was simply held up as a symbol of Apple's decline. I'm fortunate enough to have a 5300C of my own that's in great condition, and after initially being skeptical of its capabilities, just like seemingly everyone else on the internet these days, I've changed my opinion. Later macOS versions came with more native PowerPC code, so it performed even better than when it was launched. It's not perfect, of course, but it's a solid computer, even if the path to get there was a little rocky.
I said, I'll do it, like not knowing what a pain in the butt it was going to be, right? And it turned out to be a major pain in the butt, but learning lesson, and I learned a lot. Really got to work really closely with the guys doing the PowerPC and desktops. And then after that, the machine was a decent machine, decent power. It was, it was a pretty good machine, and I think networking really worked much better on that generation. I mean, Apple Talk was good for printing and stuff, but then the internet was coming along and browsers and all that stuff. So it was a much more usable machine than the earlier versions of PowerBook.
And the 5300 ended up living on in two ways. First, its motherboard architecture served as the basis for another PowerBook model, the 1400, which was well received as a solid mainstream-focused laptop. And second, the 5300's industrial designer Masamichi Utagawa had cleverly come up with a version of the chassis that was deeper in case management changed its mind about not wanting to include a full-size CD-ROM drive. This version ended up being used for the PowerBook 3400 from 1997, which was a high-end and very well-received machine. Out of the laptops I started with, I was able to assemble 2 working ones for Free Geek Twin Cities. The batteries are dead and I covered their contacts with Kapton tape just to be safe, but otherwise everything functions correctly, including the floppy drives. For 30-year-old computers that were supposed to be Apple's worst, I think 2 out of 3 isn't bad. If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. Here's another episode you should check out. And as always, thanks for watching.